She looked me in the eyes and said, "That isn't me in the video," with the calm of someone who believes they can make you doubt what you saw with your own eyes. Let me tell you something before I start. I know a lot of people are going to judge me for what I'm about to reveal here. They'll say I went too far, that I crossed a line, that a jealous man isn't worth anything. They can say that, because what I did didn't come from jealousy. It came from a certainty that took too long to confirm, and when it was confirmed, there was no room for any interpretation other than the obvious one. But I'll tell you in order, from the beginning, because if I start at the end, you won't understand the weight of hearing a woman you've shared a bed with for 8 years look at a screen, look back at you, and with a completely steady voice say that the person in that video wasn't her, when it was. My name is Brandon Whitfield. I'm 38 years old. I run an industrial equipment import company out of Atlanta, specifically heavy machinery components, generators, automation parts for manufacturing. My father helped structure the company in the 90s, and I took it over completely 12 years ago. I did mechanical engineering at Georgia Tech, followed by an MBA, worked 2 years at a logistics firm to understand operations from the outside before coming back in. I'm not telling you this to position myself as successful. I'm telling you because the profile matters for understanding how I handle decisions. I don't act on impulse. Never have. I'm the kind of man who, when he has a problem, sits with it, analyzes it, maps out what he knows and what he doesn't know, and decides based on that analysis. Sometimes I take longer than I should, but I've never acted on impulse on something that mattered. That'll be relevant. My wife, Nicole, is 35. When we married, she was a senior account manager at a PR firm in Atlanta, one of the good ones, handling national accounts. She's sharp, perceptive, the kind of person who walks into a room and immediately reads who is who, what each person wants to hear, how to position each message for each recipient. It's a rare skill, and I always admired it in her. Today I understand that skill doesn't stay confined to work. We met when I was still driving a used pickup and working 70-hour weeks. She laughed at a dry comment I made at a mutual friend's dinner, and I thought, that's the one. We married in the fall of 2015, a mid-sized ceremony at a vineyard outside Atlanta, about 100 people, outdoor reception, a band that played past the hour we'd told the venue. It was a genuinely good day. I tell people that without irony because it's true. It was a good day. Then there's Lance. Lance Foster is 40 years old. He became my business partner 8 years ago. He came in when my father stepped back, and I needed someone with a strong financial background to handle the numbers side of operations. Lance has an MBA from Columbia, had done M&A work at an investment bank before going out on his own, and was recommended by a mutual contact as someone who understood both finance and operations. We worked well together for many years. He was a groomsman at our wedding. Nicole had known him longer than she'd known me. They'd been in the same MBA cohort at Emory a few years before I met either of them. She's the one who introduced us when she found out I was looking for a partner. Said he was solid, reliable, the type who keeps his word. The irony of that is something I don't have a word for. I'll tell you exactly when I started to suspect. It was a Thursday in March, 14 months ago now. I'd come home earlier than expected. A meeting that should have run until 6 was cancelled because their executive had a medical situation. I left before 5 and was home by 4:45. I didn't call ahead. It had never been necessary in 8 years. Nicole was in the living room, sitting on the couch, phone in hand, back mostly to the door. When she heard me come in, she made a movement I couldn't precisely describe if asked, but which I registered with the part of me that registers things before processing them. The phone was put away quickly, not flipped face down on the coffee table, not slipped to her lap, put away, with the speed of someone doing something before it's seen. "You're home early," she said. "Meeting fell through. Their guy got sick." "Oh, poor him." A smile. "You want coffee?" I said sure. I went to shower. When I came back, coffee was on the counter, and she was watching a show on the streaming service, expression entirely neutral. We talked about the day, had dinner, went to bed. I didn't ask anything, not because I wasn't curious, because there wasn't language for it yet. It was just a sensation, an impression registered in a moment before any conscious processing, and sensations without evidence aren't accusation. They're either paranoia or intuition, and you don't know which until something validates or disproves them. I went to sleep with the sensation. I kept having it in the days that followed. I want to be honest about what came next, because it's the part people judge most even when they don't say so. I monitored. Not technologically, not installing anything, not reading messages. I monitored with attention, the kind that's nearly invisible because it looks exactly like a husband's normal interest in his wife's day. I asked more about her work projects, casually, conversationally, but I paid attention to inconsistencies. A meeting she'd mentioned on Monday had changed location by Thursday. A client she'd said was in Midtown seemed, from another mention, to be in Buckhead. Small things, the kind that could be explained by memory imprecision, by confusion between projects, by any number of innocent reasons. But stacked against other small things, they start to form a pattern you can't ignore even if you want to. The phone had changed, not the device, the behavior around it. In 8 years, Nicole's phone had been reasonably available in that casual way shared lives produce. I'd grab it to pull up directions when she was driving, or answer a call for her when she was in another room. Normal things. Now the phone was always with her, or face down on a surface with her seated close by. The passcode had changed. I noticed when I tried to access something minor and couldn't. She said she'd read an article about digital security and predictable passcodes. Make sense? Could also not. In April, she started going to a gym in Buckhead. She'd always worked out, but at a gym 10 minutes from our house in Virginia Highland. The new gym was across the city, 40 minutes in Atlanta traffic. She said a friend had recommended it, that the trainers were better, that the atmosphere was more professional. She went Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Left at 6, back at 9, sometimes 9:30. 3 hours including commute. Reasonable for a real gym. Reasonable for a cover too. In May, I saw an email address I didn't recognize on a shared computer in the home office. She'd forgotten to close the browser. The address was something like initials and numbers, nothing I could immediately connect to her without context. I clicked instinctively before understanding what I was doing. There were emails. I didn't read them. I closed it, but the address stayed in my memory. Lance had stopped coming to the dinners we occasionally hosted. First one excuse, then another, then the pattern of declining became the norm. When I mentioned it to Nicole, she said he was probably going through something, that he'd always been more private than he seemed. When I asked Lance at the office, he changed the subject with the fluency of someone practiced at doing that. That was the last personal conversation we had outside of strictly professional context. In July, 4 months after the Thursday of the phone, I hired the detective. I want to explain the decision process because it matters. I stayed with the possibility for weeks before acting. I researched the legal framework around private investigation in Georgia. I had a hypothetical conversation with my attorney about the use of private investigation in marital disputes. Without revealing I was seriously considering it. I assessed what the information would cost me if it confirmed my suspicions, and what not knowing would cost me if I chose to ignore it. And I assessed, with the honesty that required something of me, the genuine possibility that I was wrong, that the sensation from the Thursday was a product of my own state of mind that day, that the new passcode was exactly what she said, digital security, that the gym in Buckhead was exactly what she said, that the inconsistencies were imprecision of memory, that Lance was going through something personal that wasn't my business. I stayed with that possibility for a while. But there's a point where you have to choose between respecting the possibility of being wrong and acting to find the truth. And those two aren't incompatible, as long as the action is measured. Hiring an investigator isn't accusing, it's investigating. And investigation that returns a negative result simply gives you back the peace of mind that the sensation had taken. The detective's name is Marcus Reed. He runs a small operation in Decatur, himself and 2 field associates, all of them with law enforcement backgrounds. Recommended by a lawyer friend who'd used him in a corporate intellectual property case. My first impression was positive. Marcus has that quality of someone who's heard enough stories to have stopped being surprised by any of them, not cynically, professionally. He doesn't sell results, doesn't promise certainty before he has evidence, doesn't dramatize either the process or what he finds. First meeting, I was direct. I suspected marital infidelity, possibly involving my business partner. I needed documentation that could be used legally, because there was a business partnership with implications that went beyond the marriage. I'd pay for the time necessary. Discretion was non-negotiable. Marcus took notes, asked technical questions about routines, schedules, frequented locations, said he'd contact me when he had something concrete. I left the meeting and ate lunch alone at a Japanese place near my office. Ate slowly, paid, went back to work, attended 3 meetings, signed documents, drove home at 7. Nicole was making pasta. I kissed her in the kitchen, asked about her day. She told me about a difficult client, about a campaign that was being challenging. I listened, asked questions. We had dinner. I did all of that knowing I'd just hired someone to follow her. I'm not proud of that, but I don't regret it, because there are moments where you have to choose between the comfort of not knowing and the weight of wanting to know. And I'm the kind of man who chooses to know, even when knowing hurts. Marcus called me on a Tuesday in August, 6 weeks after our first meeting. "Can you come to your office this afternoon?" he said. "I have something to show you." I didn't ask what. I said yes. He arrived at 3, came in, greeted my assistant with the discretion of someone accustomed to not drawing attention, came to my office. I closed the door before he sat. He opened the folder he was carrying and placed a tablet on my desk, with the care of someone who's done this before and understands that what it contains will change the tone of the conversation. "Before I show you," he said, "I want you to know this material is authenticated with metadata for date, time, and geolocation. There's a technical verification process that can be presented in court if necessary." "Understood," I said. He pressed play. It was 47 seconds. "I'm going to stop here and be precise about what I can and can't say. I won't describe the content in detail beyond what's essential, because those details don't serve any purpose except humiliation. Mine, hers, everyone's. The purpose of this story is precision about what happened. What I can say, the video was recorded in a space I didn't recognize, clearly an apartment, lit by natural light coming through an open window. The camera angle was elevated, the kind you get from a phone propped somewhere. And Nicole's face was completely visible. No ambiguity, no profile, no silhouette, no partial view. The face, 47 seconds. Marcus stopped the playback. I looked at the black screen for a period of time I can't measure. "The man in the video," I said when I could. "Do you have identification?" "Not in a form that's legally conclusive yet," Marcus said, with the same neutral tone as the rest of the conversation. "The angle compromises direct ID, but we have other elements." He opened the folder. "The GPS data from the video's metadata points to a specific address in Buckhead." He placed a page on my desk. "Property registered to a corporate entity, a simple holding company, 2 shareholders." He slid another page. "The holding company is listed as a minority shareholder in a second investment vehicle." He slid another. "That second vehicle has as its primary partner Lance Foster," I said. Marcus stopped, looked at me. "You already knew." "I suspected," I said. "Knowing is different from suspecting," he continued. "There were surveillance photos, 22 days of coverage, 7 documented occasions when Nicole had entered and exited the building in Buckhead. The photos had date and time, images from the building's exterior, from the parking garage entrance, from a coffee shop across the street where she'd met someone on one occasion. I need more," I said. "I need conclusive identification of the man in the video, and documentation that shows their relationship clearly, not just shared location, but in a form that can't be contested as coincidence." Marcus said he understood, said it would take a few more weeks but was achievable. He left. I stayed in my office for a long time after that. I didn't cry. I didn't break anything. I didn't call anyone. I went to the restroom, ran cold water over my face, looked at myself in the mirror for some seconds, went back to my desk, and finished the workday. The 10 days that followed were the strangest of my life. I knew. She didn't know I knew. And I still didn't have the final evidence Marcus was obtaining. So I continued being married. Normally, or with the surface of normalcy that functions when the other person has no reason to examine the surface. We had dinner together. We watched shows. She chose what to watch, I agreed. Paid enough attention to comment if asked. We talked about work, about plans for the fall, about a trip a friend of hers was organizing. We slept on the same sides of the bed we'd always slept on. Her by the window, me by the door. There was a night when she put her hand on my arm in the dark after the lights were out and said she was appreciating how things had been feeling good lately. Said that busy lives sometimes create drift without either person noticing, but that she felt like we'd found our way back to a connected rhythm. I said I agreed. I continued looking at the ceiling in the dark. During those 10 days, I did things that needed doing. I spoke with my attorney in increasingly non-hypothetical terms about divorce law in Georgia. I consulted a business law specialist about partnership dissolution based on breach of trust. I organized personal and financial documents in a form that would be accessible to me and separate from what Nicole had access to. I prepared. Not emotionally. Emotionally, I'd crossed some point of no return the moment the tablet screen went black. Practically. Marcus called on a Friday morning in early September. "I have what you asked for," he said. "Can I come now?" Yes. We met at a coffee shop in Midtown. Neutral ground. No connection to either of us. He sat across from me with his folder. He ordered an espresso that came and cooled while he showed me what he'd brought. The photos were sharp, taken at different moments, from the sidewalk outside the building in Buckhead, from inside the parking structure, and from two exterior moments where both faces were clearly identifiable. Lance and Nicole, together, unambiguously. And there was a second thing. Marcus had done a search of public business records using the data from the holding company he'd identified. "The property in Buckhead," he said, "is in a comodato agreement registered under an investment vehicle listing two beneficiaries." He turned the page. "One is Lance Foster, by his business registration. The other," he pointed, Nicole's name, on the document. The apartment wasn't just Lance's space that she was using. She was a listed co-beneficiary. There was paperwork, there was planning, there was a legal structure that had existed long enough to be in registrable documentation. You don't put someone's name on a co-beneficiary document on impulse. This had existed for a long time. I paid, walked to my car, sat in the parking garage without starting the engine for several minutes. Then I called Nicole. "Hey," she said. It was nearly noon. "Hey, I've been leaving early a few days this week. Want to have dinner in tonight? I can pick something up or we can cook." "Of course," she said. "That sounds really nice." "Great. See you at 6. I hung up, went to the office, worked the day, left at 6. There are two ways to conduct a confrontation. The first is impulsive. You arrive with the emotional charge of everything you know, deliver it all at once, lose control of the narrative because the feeling gets ahead of the reason. It's the most natural way, the most understandable, and the one that produces the most difficult outcomes to manage afterward. The second is structured. You arrive knowing exactly what you have, knowing where the conversation will naturally go, knowing what the other person will deny and what you'll present when they do. You don't improvise because you don't need to. You let the material do the work. I chose the second. But let me tell you something about structured confrontations. They don't protect you from what you'll feel when it happens. You can have prepared every word, organized every document in the right sequence, rehearsed internally every possible response, and still have no control over what you'll feel when you hear the voice of the actual person responding. I got home at 6:15. The apartment smelled like something was being prepared in the kitchen. She'd decided to cook rather than order. She was wearing an apron she's had for a few years, one she's attached to, despite it being frayed in ways that suggest it should have been replaced. A low-key playlist was going on the Bluetooth speaker by the kitchen window. "Hey," she said, smiling over her shoulder from the stove. "Hey." I got a glass, poured water, sat on the kitchen bar stool, looked at her for a moment while she continued at the stove. The late afternoon light in the kitchen has always had a quality I liked. "Nicole," I said. Something in the tone arrived before the words, because she stopped, turned off the burner, set down the wooden spoon, turned around. "What's wrong?" I pulled out my phone, opened the video file Marcus had sent securely, placed the screen facing her on the counter, pressed play. The video played. Nicole watched it, not me, the screen, with an attention that I recognized as active, not passive, the attention of someone processing, not someone being surprised. 4, 5 seconds. "Delete that," she said. The voice was steady. No panic. Control. The quality of a person who received a situation for which they had already prepared a response, even if they hadn't known when they'd need to use it. "Nicole, Brandon, delete that video. We need to talk about this." She stepped back from the counter, walked to the living room, sat on the couch, in the center, not a corner, with the posture of someone occupying the space, crossed her legs, folded her hands in her lap, and then she said it. "That isn't me in the video," with a calm I had never heard from her before, or that I'd heard and hadn't recognized for what it was. I stood in the middle of the room between the kitchen and the couch, looking at her. "Nicole," I said. "I don't know where you got that," she said, same tone. "But that woman isn't me. I can see your face. The video has been edited." She looked at me without flinching. "Or it was manufactured by someone with the technical resources to do that. Today it's possible to put anyone's face on any video. You must know that. Nicole, I don't know who sent you this or what they want, but that woman is not me, and you need to understand that." There was something almost hypnotic about it, not because I believed it, I didn't, but because the steadiness she projected wasn't the steadiness of innocence. Innocence has a different quality, more chaotic, more confused, more questions before assertions. What she was presenting was structure, the script of someone who had calculated that total denial was the best defense and had decided to execute with conviction. "I hired a private investigator," I said. The first shift. Something crossed her eyes. Not guilt yet. Anger. And beneath the anger, something colder. Assessment. She was measuring how much I knew. "You hired someone to spy on me," she said, slowly, as if testing the weight of the words. "To investigate a suspicion. A suspicion you had about me, Brandon. Without talking to me. Without asking me anything. Without giving me any opportunity for dialogue." She stood up. "Do you know what that says about you? About how you see me? About how you see this marriage?" And that's when I understood fully what she was doing. She wasn't defending herself. She was flipping the game. In the 15 minutes that followed, I watched the most calculated move I've ever seen in a conversation. Nicole didn't deny the video by defending her faithfulness, presenting arguments for her fidelity, asking me to trust her. She denied the video by attacking my judgment. She said I was jealous, said I'd always been, that she'd noticed early in the relationship but had chosen to believe it was something I could manage with time, that she'd been patient, that she'd made accommodations over the years, avoiding certain situations, not going to certain events, because she'd perceived that some things created discomfort in me and preferred to avoid conflict. She said hiring a private investigator was the act of a man with pathological jealousy, not normal jealousy, compulsive, destructive jealousy, the kind that destroys healthy relationships from within because no evidence of faithfulness is ever sufficient for someone who suffers from chronic distrust. She said she was worried about me, worried about my mental health. She said the video had likely been digitally manipulated, that she had clients who worked in technology, and that the level of editing sophistication available today produced results indistinguishable from reality. Said there was probably a competitor of mine, or a former employee, or someone I didn't know about, using this to destabilize my marriage from within, knowing it was the most efficient way to affect my professional stability. Said I needed help, professional help, that she would be there with me through that process, that I shouldn't feel ashamed, that mental health issues weren't weakness, that she could research specialists if I wanted. There was a perverse elegance to it that, even perceiving what it was, made me uncomfortable for a moment, because if I accepted that narrative, if I internalized her map of the situation, I stopped being the betrayed husband confronting a betrayal. I became the unstable husband who had manufactured evidence to confirm a pre-existing paranoia. The position of each of us in this story reversed completely. She emerged as the victim of an unstable spouse. I emerged as the problem requiring treatment. And the other thing, which I only understood more completely later, is that this narrative hadn't been invented that night. It had been built over time, in conversations with her friends about my controlling tendencies, in comments to me on various occasions that positioned my attention to detail as something approaching paranoia, in the systematic, persistent, subtle establishment, over years, of a context in which my distrust could be read as a symptom of my own problem rather than a response to her behavior. Building the defense narrative before the defense is needed is what transforms gaslighting from an improvisation into a strategy. "Are you done?" I said. She frowned. "What? What you wanted to say. Are you done?" "Brandon, I think you—" "Sit down," I said, something in the tone. She sat. I pulled the folder from the bag I'd left at the entrance, placed it on the coffee table, opened it. The photographs were printed on quality photo paper, with date and time in the footer of each image, and the authentication signature in the lower right corner. Each photo had its chain of custody documented on the back. I placed them one by one. Nicole and Lance in front of the building in Buckhead. Midday image, clear light, both faces completely visible. Nicole and Lance at the apartment entrance, the camera catching the floor number visible above the elevator button. A closer image showing both of them inside an apartment in an intimate conversation. No sexual content, but with the specific intimacy of people who share a space that is theirs. And the corporate document, the co-beneficiary registration with both names, the establishment date, the property address. I placed everything in sequence on the coffee table, without commentary, without speech. I let the material do the work. Nicole looked at each photo. Her eyes stopped on the document. She was silent for a period I could measure by hearing my own breathing. Then she said, "You planted that." That was the moment I understood she had decided not to yield. This was no longer defensive denial. It was a second line of attack that had been held in reserve for the moment the first failed. "I planted photographs that an investigator took over 22 days of coverage," I said. "You paid someone to fabricate evidence." She looked at me with the steadiness of someone who had decided on the ground she was going to hold. "It happens. You made a decision before any conversation, went looking for confirmation, and when there wasn't any, manufactured it. Nicole, your name is on that document. Documents can be forged. This is a registered business filing, public record. Records can be altered, especially by someone with resources to hire private investigators. There was a very specific moment in this conversation when I understood something. I'd understood partially, but not completely. That certain types of lying aren't about persuading. They're about exhausting. You don't deny because you believe you'll convince the other person. You deny because you know that reiterated, insistent, progressively more elaborate denial eventually makes the other person begin to question their own perception, not by believing the version being presented, but by exhaustion from dealing with someone who completely refuses what is real. It's a form of violence that leaves no visible mark. "So tell me," I said, "from your point of view, what's happening? Give me your version of what I'm looking at." She looked at me for a moment, assessment still happening, measuring how much I knew, how much I believed what I knew, how much room there was to work. "What's happening," she said carefully, "is that you're in crisis. Something shifted in you at some point and made you start seeing threats where there aren't any. And instead of getting help, you went looking for confirmation of a narrative you'd already built in your head. It's a classic pattern of attachment anxiety. There's real literature on this. I can send it to you." "Literature," I repeated. "Brandon, I love you. And that's exactly why I'm saying this clearly. You need help, and I'm going to be there with you. You're going to be there with me." "Yes." I looked at her for a moment. "All right," I said. "I'm going to show you one more thing." I opened my phone. There was a second recording that I'd requested from Marcus without explaining the specific reason. I'd said only that I needed audio documentation of communications related to the case. Marcus had explained the legal parameters, and within those parameters had obtained a call Nicole had made from a number she used for personal communications on an afternoon when she'd been in a location with low ambient attention. The recording was 2 minutes and 43 seconds. I placed the phone on the table with the volume high enough for her to hear clearly. Nicole's voice, unmistakably hers, talking to someone about the need to use the Buckhead apartment with more caution for now, saying she'd noticed Brandon was more attentive lately, mentioning the new phone passcode and how the explanation she'd given made sense and he bought it, saying she needed to hold things together for a few more months and that after a specific point, which she didn't detail, but which had the quality of something planned with the other person, it would be easier. Hold things together. 2 minutes and 43 seconds. When it ended, I put the phone back on the table. Nicole was silent for a long time. The quality of the silence had changed completely. It was no longer the silence of someone calculating the next line of defense. It was the silence of someone who realized the ground had ended. "You recorded my calls," she said finally. "Not an accusation, a realization. An investigator obtained the recording within legally documented parameters. That's invasive. There's a legal analysis of this specific recording's admissibility and the context in which it was obtained. You can take it to a judge if you want, but it might be worth consulting an attorney first about what comes out in a full evidentiary analysis." She looked at me, and something changed in her expression. Not an apology, not a collapse, something closer to a recalibration, like she was updating her map of the situation and discovering the terrain was different from what she'd calculated. "How long have you known?" she said. "Long enough." "How long, Brandon?" 14 months of suspicion, 2 months of certainty. She closed her eyes for a second. "You stayed with me for 2 months knowing, waiting until I had everything I needed." A silence. "Lance," she said finally. "We're not talking about Lance tonight. Brandon, not today. This conversation is about you and me. I need to pause here and be honest about what that conversation was from my side. There's a version of this story in which the confrontation is a moment of clarity and power. The narrator who had everything organized, who presented the evidence calmly, who didn't lose control while the other person collapsed. The truth is more complicated. Yes, I had prepared. Yes, I knew what I had and what to present. But being prepared doesn't make you immune to the weight of having that conversation with that person. In that apartment, after 8 years, there was a moment. It was when she said, "Hold things together," and I recognized that the words in the recording had come out of her with the same naturalness as any other sentence, as if managing a parallel life was just another project to be administered. There was in that moment a specific sadness that didn't take the shape I'd expected. Not the sadness of being betrayed. I'd already processed that. The sadness of the volume of lying that had been necessary. The quantity of attention and energy and planning that had been invested in keeping that going, while also keeping the marriage going. The way I had been accounted for over that time, not as a person, but as a variable to be managed. You don't spend 2 years with a parallel life alongside someone without looking at that someone every day and seeing them in a particular way, and that way isn't loving. The night was long. Nicole didn't leave immediately. She stayed. Whether by calculation, by disorientation, by that part of someone who's been fully exposed that doesn't know what to do when the script ends, I can't say. Around 10, she began to cry. I won't tell you it was false. I also won't tell you it was genuine, because after everything that night had revealed about what I hadn't seen in the years before, I didn't trust my ability to read what was real in her. What I can say is that it was there, and then she spoke, with a voice different from the one she'd used before, less structured, more fractured. She said she'd gotten lost, said she couldn't identify exactly when or how, that things with Lance had started one way and become something else, that there had been a point where she'd realized she was somewhere she hadn't planned and didn't know how to leave. I listened to all of it, not because I believed every word, because listening is part of understanding, not for forgiveness, but for having the complete picture, to know whether what had happened was a decision or a drift, whether it had been intentional or careless, whether the person I'd seen in the evidence was someone I'd never known or someone who had become something different over time. How long? I said when she paused. 2 years, she said. The apartment, 18 months. A pause. Yes. Then 6 months of something before the apartment. 6 months of a thing that wasn't yet stable enough to have an address. And then the apartment, the holding company, her name on the document, the institutionalization of something that had moved from accident to choice. Did you ever intend to tell me? She didn't answer immediately. The silence before the answer told me more than the answer. I don't know, she said finally, which was the honest answer, which meant probably not, which meant, as long as it worked, it would have continued. I asked her to leave that night. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make threats. I said it with the voice of someone who has made a decision that won't change. She asked where she'd go. I said that wasn't a problem I needed to solve for her. She packed a small bag, clothes for a few days, essential personal items, said something I won't repeat here because it only serves to record that she still tried, up until the last moment, to leave a door slightly open. I didn't respond. The door closed. I sat in the living room with the folder of photographs on the coffee table and the phone beside it and the particular silence of an apartment from which the other person has just left. I sat for a long time. It wasn't relief. It wasn't victory. It was the weight of something real landing. In the days that followed, Nicole called her friends, her family. I don't know exactly what she said to each of them. Different versions reached me through different channels. What seemed to be the central narrative: that Brandon had had an episode of pathological jealousy, that he'd hired an investigator and manufactured evidence, that he was in crisis, and she'd left for her safety. Some people reached out to me with the specific care of someone who has heard 2 very different versions of a situation and doesn't want to take explicit sides. A mutual friend texted to say she was thinking of me, and that these situations are always complex. A relative of Nicole's called to say she was concerned about the situation, in language that revealed she'd heard Nicole's version without having heard mine. The community divided. Not dramatically. No public conflict, no scene. But there's a difference between the people who called to ask how I was doing and those who went silent, and that difference says something about what each had believed. For Nicole's father, with whom I'd always had a solid relationship, I sent the primary documents with a simple explanation that he deserved access to the information that existed, that I expected nothing specific in return, and that whatever decision he made about what to do with it was entirely his. A long silence after he finished listening. "I didn't know," he said. The voice carried a quality I'd never heard in it before. "I know you didn't," I said. "Are you going to—" He paused. "Give any chance?" "No." Another silence. "I understand," he said, and hung up. "Lance." I went to the office on Monday, called Lance into my office, closed the door. No performative hostility, nothing beyond the objectivity of what needed to happen. I placed the folder on the desk in front of him. He looked at it for a moment. "Brandon? No, not today." I stood up. "I'm initiating the process of partnership dissolution based on documented breach of trust. My attorney will contact yours. You can continue using the office normally while the process runs, because operations can't stop. But any communication about this matter will be exclusively through legal channels. You need to hear, I don't need anything from you that isn't what the attorneys are going to negotiate." I left the room. There was no conversation Lance clearly wanted to have. Not that day, not over the months the legal process ran, not after it concluded. The dissolution took 6 months. It was technically complex because the partnership had 8 years of joint operations and a significant amount of assets to evaluate. It came out within what my attorney called reasonable given the context, which is legal language for saying he walked away with less than he would have in a standard strategic disagreement dissolution, but more than nothing. The divorce was finalized 7 months after the night of the photographs. I won't detail the legal process because that's not what this is about. What I can say, it was the kind of process that occurs when sufficient documentation exists for both parties to understand that any contest will be fought on ground that's unfavorable for one of them. Nicole had a good attorney. Mine was better prepared for this specific situation. There were tense moments. There were communications that reached me through indirect channels, which I forwarded to my attorney without responding. There was an episode in which the narrative she'd built reached someone with some relevance to a specific business relationship of mine. That episode resolved with more cost to whoever had tried than to me. In the end, what remained was a signature on a document that made official what the night of the photographs had made real. About the house. We sold it. I didn't track the process beyond what was necessary. My attorney handled the details, and I got confirmation when it was done. I felt nothing specific when it sold. Not relief, not sadness, nothing with form. It was a property that had stopped being my home before it stopped being my property. The only thing that came to me, when my attorney messaged to confirm the closing, was that I'd bought that house believing it was where Nicole and I would live for years ahead. That we'd chosen that neighborhood because it worked for both of us. That the shelving unit we'd assembled together on a Saturday afternoon with more argument about level than we'd expected was now in someone else's home. That the window that looked out over the street and through which I'd looked on so many late weekday evenings was now part of someone else's life. These aren't heavy things. They're just observations. Life moves forward. Things pass to other people and continue existing without you. The apartment in Virginia Highland now has that morning light window. That's enough. More than a year has passed since the night of the photographs. If you ask me how I'm doing, I'll tell you the truth. I'm well, not in the performative sense, genuinely well, in the quiet, daily sense of someone who went through something heavy and came out the other side with less than they had, but with more clarity about what matters. The company went through a difficult period with the dissolution. Replacing 8 years of shared operation isn't simple, but it was an opportunity to restructure things I'd left stagnant because the convenience of continuity was easier than necessary reform. Today the financial operation is more solid than it was with Lance, which says more about what was problematic there than I'd wanted to see. I haven't found anyone, haven't actively looked, haven't actively avoided. There have been situations, none worth detailing because they're recent and without clear shape. What I found was something simpler. I learned to be precise about what deserves my time and trust. Not cynically. I didn't become a man who systematically distrusts everything and everyone. I learned to pay attention to what I see, and not only what I want to see. To understand that when something seems wrong, the instinct that identifies the wrongness usually knows more than the reason that tries to explain it away. Last thing, there's a question I never asked publicly, but asked myself many times across this period. What kind of man did I become at the end of this? Not in the simplified moral sense, did you do the right or wrong thing? In the more honest sense, what does this experience reveal about how you face what you don't want to face? And what does it change in you for the years ahead? The first thing I noticed, in the weeks after everything was formally resolved, was that I'd become more patient with uncertainty. Not in the comfortable way, in the way that comes from having lived with uncertainty for months without being able to resolve it immediately. Uncertainty sustained over time teaches you that you can function within it without collapsing. That's not a virtue I'd have developed any other way. The second thing, I learned to distinguish intuition from anxiety. Anxiety looks like intuition because it also produces alert sensations, also tells you something is wrong, also keeps you vigilant. The difference is that anxiety creates patterns where there are none, and intuition recognizes patterns where they exist. On the Thursday of the phone, what I felt wasn't anxiety. It was the recognition of a specific pattern, the motion of putting something away before being seen, with the particular speed of someone who has rehearsed that motion. Anxiety would have made me see that motion in every day that followed, in every phone, in every gesture. What I had was a surgical impression at a specific moment, confirmed by subsequent patterns, which at the end proved to be correct. I'm not claiming my intuition is infallible. No human being's is. I'm saying I learned to distinguish the quality of the signal, and I'm saying that when the signal has those qualities, it's worth paying attention to it. Here's something I never told anyone, and that I've decided to include because this story doesn't make sense without it. 3 days before hiring Marcus, I had decided not to hire him. I'd arrived at the conclusion that I was being paranoid, that the sum of things I'd observed was compatible with innocent explanations, and that the way I'd combined them into a narrative of betrayal said more about my state of mind than about the actual situation. I spent 1 full day with that conclusion. Felt relieved, the way you feel relieved when you decide you don't have to do something difficult. But there was a quality to the relief that wasn't completely solid. The next morning I woke at 4, which happens to me when something is being processed in ways I haven't finished processing. I lay in the dark, thinking about what I'd decided the day before, and I realized the relief I'd felt wasn't the relief of having arrived at the truth. It was the relief of having found a way not to have to act, of not having to face the possibility that the sensation was real. That's not the same thing. I got up, made coffee, sat on the balcony with the coffee and the 4 a.m. silence of Atlanta, stayed there for an hour. Then I got dressed, drove to the office, and that afternoon called the lawyer who'd recommended Marcus. Because between the comfort of not knowing and the weight of knowing, I still prefer the wait, always have. Before I actually end, if someone you love looks at the evidence of what they've done and tells you with absolute certainty that it wasn't them, that you were deceived, that you need help, are you going to trust yourself, or are you going to trust the voice insisting that your perception is wrong? Leave it in the comments. It doesn't have to be long. It can be a word. It can be your own story. I read everyone. If this story stayed with you, give it a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear that trusting yourself when the other person denies what you saw with your own eyes isn't jealousy. It's the sanest thing there is. Subscribe to the channel. Until the next story. There's something else that belongs here. Something I left implied, but that deserves to be said clearly, because the story doesn't carry its full weight without it. I want to tell you about what it was like to keep going during those 10 days. Not the surface of it. I've described that. I mean the internal quality of those days. What it actually feels like to know something and not be able to say it, to act on it, to even show on your face that you know it. The first thing I noticed was how much energy deception requires of the deceiver. And I don't mean Nicole's deception. I mean mine. The small deception of continuing to function normally, of asking about her day and listening to the answer with apparent interest, of making coffee in the morning and saying good morning and not letting any of what I knew show in my eyes. I was good at it, better than I expected. That concerned me slightly, not in a moral sense, but in the sense of what it reveals about capacity, about the possibility that we're all, in certain circumstances, better actors than we think we are. The second thing was the particular loneliness of it. I couldn't tell anyone, not my attorney, not in detail, not yet, not friends, not family, not the people who would normally be the sounding board for something this large. I was carrying a complete knowledge of the end of my marriage and carrying it entirely alone. There's a specific quality to that kind of solitude. It has weight. It takes up space in a way that ordinary solitude doesn't, because ordinary solitude is absence, and this was presence, the constant presence of something that couldn't yet be released. The third thing, which I'll admit because honesty requires it, there were moments of something that I'd have to call grief even before the confrontation. Quiet, anticipatory grief. The kind that happens when you know a thing is ending but you're still inside it. I sat across from Nicole at dinner on one of those evenings. She was telling me about a client breakthrough, actually animated about it in the way she gets when work goes well, and I felt something that was both present and already past, a kind of double exposure, the real moment and the memory of it simultaneously. I didn't know what to do with that except to be in it and let it be. About the specifics of the legal process, because some of you will wonder, Georgia is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets are divided according to what a court determines is fair, not necessarily 50-50. Fault grounds for divorce exist in Georgia, and documented adultery is one of them. In practice, whether and how fault affects distribution varies significantly by judge, by attorney, by the specific circumstances. My attorney was experienced with exactly this combination of circumstances. His assessment going in. The documentation we had was strong enough to ensure that any contested proceeding would be disadvantageous for Nicole's position on asset distribution. That assessment proved accurate. The negotiations, while not without friction, resolved within a range that my attorney characterized as favorable. I won't give specific numbers because they're not the point, and because some things deserve to stay private. What I can say, the settlement was fair by any objective measure. Not generous to her, not punitive, fair. That was what I wanted, an ending that was clean and correct, not one that dragged or required further years of litigation or produced a result that felt like score settling. I have enough to rebuild from. That was the goal. About Lance and the business partnership specifically, because there are details there that matter. The complexity of dissolving an 8-year business partnership is substantial. It's not like ending a personal relationship, where the separation is primarily emotional with some logistical aspects. A business partnership dissolution involves asset valuation, contract assignments, client relationship management, staff considerations, and legal filings that have to be sequenced correctly to protect both parties' interests, even when one of those parties is someone you'd rather not be protecting. I made a deliberate decision early in the process to keep the dissolution as professional and as clean as possible, not out of generosity to Lance, out of self-interest. A messy, contested dissolution is bad for business regardless of who's technically in the right. Clients notice instability. Employees get anxious. Suppliers and vendors wonder about continuity. I couldn't afford any of that. My attorney negotiated hard on valuation. Lance's attorney pushed back. We went back and forth over several months. In the end, Lance received a buyout that was below what he might have gotten in a mutually agreed strategic dissolution. The documentation of the breach of trust gave us leverage, but above zero, which is where it might have landed if we'd taken certain other approaches. I don't know what Lance did after. I genuinely don't. The information doesn't reach me because I've been deliberate about not cultivating channels through which it could. He's not my concern anymore in any dimension. Here's one more thing about the night of the confrontation that I haven't fully described. After Nicole left, after the door closed, after the particular silence settled in the apartment, I sat for what might have been 30 minutes or might have been 2 hours. I genuinely can't say. At some point during that sitting, I looked at the coffee table where the photographs were still spread out. I looked at them, not reviewing them, not looking for something I'd missed, just looking at them as objects in the space. And I picked them up, all of them, put them back in the folder in order, closed the folder, put the folder in my bag, not to hide them. They'd served their purpose. I was keeping them because my attorney had said to retain everything physical until the legal matters were fully resolved. But the act of picking them up and putting them away, there was something in that motion that felt like closing, not closure in the feel-good sense, just the quiet finality of a chapter that has been read and is being set aside. I've thought about that moment a few times since. It's one of the clearest images I have from that night. Not the confrontation itself, not the moment she said that woman wasn't her. That image is sharp, but it's charged. The image of picking up the photographs and putting them in order and closing the folder is clear in a different way. Quiet. Almost procedural. I think I knew then, in a way that hadn't fully crystallized before that moment, that it was actually over. Not emotionally finished. Emotions take longer. But over in the sense that there was no version of what came next that involved us. The folder went into my bag. I turned off the lights. I went to bed. I slept for the first time in weeks without being woken up by my own thoughts. One last thing before I finish, about something I got wrong. I said at the start that I don't act on impulse. That's true, but I've realized in looking back at this period that non-impulsive isn't the same as always right. There were moments where I was too slow, where the evidence was clear enough to act sooner than I did, where the 10 days of continuing to wait were more about my own unwillingness to have the confrontation than about strategic necessity. I stayed, because I told myself I was waiting for more documentation, and I was, but I was also waiting, because some part of me wasn't ready. Some part of me was still hoping that one of the explanations I'd given myself in the early months would turn out to be right, that the Thursday of the phone would have some innocent explanation I hadn't thought of yet. That's not analysis. That's grief in a different form. The unwillingness to fully believe a thing even when you know it. I'm telling you this not as an apology to Nicole. I don't owe her an apology for finding out and confronting. I'm telling you because anyone who's been in a situation of building undeniable suspicion knows that the period between knowing and acting can be driven by more than strategy. Sometimes what looks like patience is actually delayed grief. And that's human. That's not a flaw, but it's worth naming. You can know something and still not be ready for it to be real. That's not weakness. It's just how the mind manages certain kinds of pain. Now, for real, the end. If you've listened to all of this, thank you. Hit the like button if this story stayed with you. Share it if someone you know needs to hear that trusting your own perception, even when someone is insisting you're wrong, is not a problem to be treated. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done the moment the screen went black and she said that woman wasn't her? I read every response. Subscribe to the channel. Next story is coming. I want to add something about the business side that I passed over too quickly, because it's part of what made this situation different from a purely personal one. When Lance and I formed the partnership 8 years ago, we structured it the way most business partnerships are structured. A shareholders' agreement, provisions for dissolution on various grounds including mutual agreement and breach of fiduciary duty, buy-sell provisions that tried to anticipate the most common scenarios under which a partnership might need to end. We didn't anticipate this one. There's nothing in a standard shareholders' agreement about what happens when one partner has an affair with the other partner's spouse. That's not a standard category of breach, and yet it created an obvious conflict. How do you maintain a professional relationship with someone who has been systematically deceiving you in your personal life? How do you trust someone's judgment in a boardroom when you know they've been exercising profoundly bad judgment in private? My attorney's position was that the affair, while not explicitly covered as a breach ground in the agreement, established a context of breach of trust that could support a claim under the more general provisions. Lance's attorney disagreed, predictably. The negotiation, as I mentioned, went back and forth. What ultimately resolved it wasn't a legal argument. It was the documentary evidence. Lance's attorney, once he'd reviewed what we had, understood that the alternative to a negotiated resolution was a proceeding in which that evidence would be entered into the record. Whatever the legal outcome might be, the reputational and professional implications for Lance of that record being public were substantial. The negotiated resolution was better for him than the alternative. He took it. I was fine with that outcome. A clean ending was the goal, not retribution. Something about how people respond to this kind of situation that I've been thinking about since it happened. There's a tendency, when someone hears a story like this, to look for the moment where you should have known. The hindsight that makes the whole sequence seem inevitable and preventable if only you'd been paying the right kind of attention at the right time. I've done that exercise myself many times, and here's what I've found. The signals I could point to, the Thursday of the phone, the new passcode, the gym in Buckhead, Lance stopping coming to dinners, were all real. But each of them, individually, had an innocent explanation that was at least as plausible as the suspicious one. What you're supposed to learn from that supposedly is, trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't explain away the signals. I think that's partially right. But it misses something important. The explanation you give yourself for each individual signal isn't just rationalization. It's also the appropriate response to incomplete evidence. You shouldn't accuse someone of something based on one gesture you interpreted a particular way when there are other interpretations available. That's not blindness. That's fairness. The problem isn't any single signal. The problem is when you recognize that the pattern of signals is becoming too coherent to explain away separately, when the explanations you're giving yourself start to require more and more coincidence to hold together, when the innocent version of events requires you to believe that three unrelated things happened at once in a way that perfectly served the suspicious narrative. That's when the pattern crosses a threshold. And once it crosses that threshold, continuing to look for innocent explanations isn't fairness, it's avoidance. I hit that threshold, and then I acted. It took longer than it should have, but it happened. That's the version of trust your gut that I actually believe in. Not individual sensation, but the accumulated pattern reaching a point where the innocent explanations require too much coincidence to be sustained. One final thought, because it's been with me since this began, and I've never said it out loud. The 47-second video. That clip exists somewhere. It's on someone's phone or was on someone's phone. It was recorded deliberately. The angle, the lighting, the quality, none of it was accidental. Someone wanted a record of that moment. Why? I've thought about that more times than I'd like to admit. The most charitable interpretation is that it wasn't intended as a record of anything, that it was a casual recording made in a private moment without much thought. The less charitable interpretation is that it was made with a purpose, that someone, at some level, wanted documentation of something, whether for insurance, for memory, for some future use I can't know. I'm not going to tell you which interpretation I believe. I don't know, and not knowing is something I've had to make peace with, because the answer doesn't change anything material about the outcome. What I can tell you is that the existence of that recording, its accidental discovery by Marcus, its role in what followed, is the kind of thing that makes you think about how much of what happens in life is contingent. How many endings are produced not by some inevitable logic, but by a specific, particular, almost random event that could easily have not occurred. If Nicole hadn't forgotten to close the browser that evening in May, I might not have seen the email address. If Marcus hadn't happened to be in the right position on the right afternoon, he might not have captured the audio. If the camera angle had been slightly different, the 47 seconds might not have been definitive. I don't think about this with regret. I don't wish for any alternate version in which I stayed, but I think about it with something like awe at the specific fragility of how knowledge arrives, how the truth that changes everything can hang on a forgotten browser tab and a phone left in a particular position. We build our lives on foundations we can't fully inspect, and sometimes an unplanned 47 seconds reveals what the foundation actually is. Now I'm done. Thank you for listening. Give this a like if it stayed with you. Share it if someone needs it. And subscribe, because I have more stories like this one. Until next time.